my sincere hope that this hearing moves the ball forward and we can ultimately agree on both sides of the aisle that the origins of COVID-19 cannot be solved by science alone. Starting in early 2020, there were rumblings about the possibility COVID-19 came from a lab, likely in Wuhan. Every month since then, more and more circumstantial evidence has come to light suggesting this is the case. On January 15, 2021, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo released a fact sheet regarding some intelligence gathered surrounding the origins of COVID-19. The fact sheet stated three things. First, there were numerous researchers inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology that were sick in the fall of 2019. While this doesn't prove COVID-19 came from the lab, it is a data point suggesting so. Just 2 weeks ago, an expert in emerging disease outbreaks testified before this subcommittee that researchers in a lab becoming sick would be consistent with a research-related lab outbreak. Second, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has a published record of gain-of-function research, including at low biosafety levels. And again, we know that much of this work was done with U.S.-based EcoHealth Alliance. And we know that EcoHealth Alliance has failed to publish all its work and has in fact refused to share its work with the U.S. government. In other words, U.S. taxpayer-funded risky research that may have sparked a pandemic is being hidden by a U.S. entity in China. Third, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has cooperated with the Chinese military since at least 2017, including on animal laboratory experiments. The Biden administration did not and still has not disagreed with these facts. A senior Biden State Department official said, quote, "No one is disputing the information, the fact that those data points exist, the fact that they are accurate," end quote. Ironically enough, the Biden administration takes issue with the fact that the Trump administration released these facts. The same officials said, quote, "The Trump administration put spin on the ball," end quote. I think the fact sheet is pretty clear and non-biased. It even stated that the U.S. government does not know exactly where, when, or how the COVID-19 virus was initially transmitted to humans. That is true. The rest are simply statements of fact derived from available intelligence. Next, on October 29, 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its first declassified assessment on COVID-19 origins. This stated unequivocally that both a laboratory and natural origin are plausible. Since then, more reporting has emerged. FBI Director Christopher Wray confirmed publicly that the FBI assessed COVID-19 most likely originated from a lab incident in Wuhan. And the Wall Street Journal reported the Department of Energy now also believes a lab leak is the most likely origin. The fact that it is these two agencies is important. The FBI uses experts in biological threats and was reportedly supported by the National Bioforensic Analysis Center, and the Department of Energy used its own Z division, experts in investigating biological threats. These are both scientific and intelligence experts. While the specific origin of COVID-19 may not be 100% clear, there's mounting evidence suggesting a research or lab-related incident. What is clear, though, is that China does not want the globe to know the origins. They dodge and duck every legitimate attempt to investigate this question. According to the fact sheet, China has systematically prevented a transparent and thorough investigation of the COVID-19 pandemic's origin. According to the ODNI report, China has hindered global investigations, resisted sharing information, and reported to blaming other countries, including the United States. This became even more clear when we received this email from the Chinese embassy last week. Without objection, I would ask unanimous consent to enter this email into the record. In it, the Chinese embassy expresses grave concern regarding this hearing and states they firmly oppose it. Well, we have some news for Beijing. These intimidation tactics will not work. You will not slow down our work, and we will not cease. After the hearing, I'll be sending a letter to the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. requesting China cease intimidation tactics and cooperate with this investigation. I extend the invitation to any member of this subcommittee to join me on that letter. Thank you. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Ruiz for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Understanding the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic is important to America's public health and our ability to respond to future public health threats. In fact, since the first outbreak of COVID-19, researchers in the scientific community have worked tirelessly to get to the bottom of this very issue with dozens of studies that have been conducted or are currently underway. And agents in the intelligence community have continued their sweeping assessment of COVID-19's origins. Thanks to President Biden's direction and leadership, we are learning more every day. In May 2021, he directed the intelligence community to evaluate whether the novel coronavirus could have emerged from a laboratory in China, urging our nation's intelligence agencies to do, quote, everything we can to trace the roots of this outbreak. Since then, 2 government agencies have assessed with low and moderate confidence that the virus originated in a lab, while 4 government agencies assess with low confidence that the virus came about through natural transmission. As it stands, there is no consensus. The reports are inconclusive, and more research is needed. While our scientists and intelligence communities continue their investigations, it is crucial that we empower them to do so without extreme partisan rhetoric or political biases that cherry-pick evidence to push a partisan political narrative that vilify public health leaders. Our focus as lawmakers should be on developing policies based on current and evolving evidence to prevent and prepare for future pandemics and save lives. To do right by the American people and our public health, we must let our expert communities do their job. And in turn, we must develop policies based on evidence, as inconclusive as it may be at the moment, that will help us prevent the next pandemic no matter which COVID origin theory you believe in. We must also take a deep dive into the barriers to our nation's ability to research the origins of COVID and respond to it. This includes examining how the Chinese Communist Party's refusal to cooperate with international investigations in December 2019 set us back in our pandemic response, and how the Chinese Communist Party's continued spread of misinformation and obfuscation of evidence has hindered our ability to understand both theories of how this virus came to be in the first place. In order to better be prepared for the future, it is crucial that we develop forward-looking domestic and foreign policies that advance American interests, protect our public health, and save lives. This means rejecting the isolationist approach President Trump took under the guise of, quote, America first, unquote, that decimated the State Department, weakened our ability to engage, left a void that rendered America vulnerable to China's growing influence. It also abandoned state-to-state diplomacy, allowed tensions to intensify, and escalated a trade war that fell hardest on American workers. Under this approach, America's public health, economy, and security ultimately paid the price. So now, we must take decisive action to protect our public health, economy, and security from the CCP's growing influence by investing in competition, deepening collaboration with our allies, and furthering the State Department's diplomatic work. That means building on the progress we've made with legislation like the CHIPS and Science Act to invest in innovation so that we can outcompete China in sectors critical to our public health and national defense, and strengthening our supply chain. And that means building on House Democrats and the Biden administration's work to bolster our pandemic preparedness, public health infrastructure, and international and domestic standards for pandemic surveillance to address possible animal transmissions, and biomedical research safety to address possible lab leaks. There is certainly more work to do, and it is my sincere hope that we can pursue this work together on a bipartisan basis. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how global health security, pandemic preparedness, and national security are linked. And so as we seek to better understand the virus's origins, we must take a scientific and evidence-based approach. As physician and ranking member of this select subcommittee, I take this charge seriously of putting people over politics to protect our public health. We should do this work without the politicization and extreme partisan rhetoric that get in the way of common sense solutions to the public health challenges we face. Let's get to work on forward-looking policies that will prevent and reduce the harm of future viruses and pandemics without vilifying our nation's public health officials. The world is watching what we are doing here today, and it is my hope that we rise to the occasion and that we meet the moment with the integrity that our global health and national security demand.
Thank you, Dr. Ruiz. Pursuant to Committee on Oversight and Accountability Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. Our witnesses today are the Honorable John Ratcliffe. Director Ratcliffe was most recently the Director of National Intelligence, serving as the Principal Intelligence Advisor to the President. Prior to that, he served in Congress and as a member of the House Intelligence, Homeland Security, and Judiciary Committees. Mr. David Feith. Mr. Feith is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And Dr. Mark Lowenthal. Dr. Lowenthal previously served as the Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production, and also as Vice Chairman for Evaluation on the National Intelligence Council. The Select Subcommittee certainly appreciates you all for being here today. We appreciate your service, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired, and we would ask that you please wrap up. I now recognize Director Ratcliffe to give an opening statement.
Chairman Wenstrup, Ranking Member Ruiz, members of the committee, it's a pleasure for me to be back in the House of Representatives, where I spent 6 years serving on the House Intelligence, Judiciary, and Homeland Security committees before leaving Congress when I was confirmed by the Senate to serve as the Director of National Intelligence in the Trump administration. My confirmation was actually the first in-person Senate hearing after the COVID-19 pandemic began, and during it, I promised to ensure that the intelligence community would be laser-focused on getting answers to the virus's origins and spread. What follows is a brief, unclassified overview of what the intelligence community learned and knows, a synopsis of the relevant challenges that I encountered during this effort, and where I believe we must go from here. First, let me state the bottom line up front. My informed assessment, as a person with as much access as anyone to our government's intelligence during the initial year of the pandemic, has been and continues to be that a lab leak is the only explanation credibly supported by our intelligence, by science, and by common sense. From a view inside the IC, if our intelligence and evidence supporting a lab leak theory was placed side by side with our intelligence and evidence pointing to a natural origins or spillover theory, the lab leak side of the ledger would be long, convincing, even overwhelming, while the spillover side would be nearly empty and tenuous. Were this a trial, a preponderance of circumstantial evidence provided by our intelligence would compel a jury finding of guilt to an accusation that coronavirus research in the Wuhan labs was responsible for the pandemic, and likewise, the Chinese Communist Party would be guilty of going to great lengths to cover up the virus's origins, from destroying medical tests, samples, and data, to intimidating and disappearing witnesses and journalists, to lying and coercing global health authorities, even spreading propaganda that the virus originated here in the United States by the U.S. military. Their efforts continue to this day, as the Chinese embassy has formally objected to this hearing and this committee's efforts to ascertain the truth. And the Chinese government has done all of this while proving itself incapable of offering even a shred of exculpatory evidence. The intelligence community's sources on this issue are numerous, diverse, and unassailable, and I hope that the recent unanimous congressional support to require the declassification of our COVID origins material will make some of this available to you and the American people. Right now, a few of the intelligence community's agencies are publicly assessing that COVID-19 virus originated from a lab leak in Wuhan, and as this shift continues, the day will come when every single agency in the IC will make the same assessment, which begs the question, why have they not to this point? It's a simple and obvious question that does not have a simple answer. The challenges that I and other senior Trump administration officials encountered while in office included legitimate concerns about our closely held sources and methods of intelligence, as well as illegitimate roadblocks that related to professional conflicts of interest and partisan politics. These included the headwinds created when a lab leak assessment was initially labeled falsely and falsely reported with near unanimity as a conspiracy theory by conflicted scientists and by mainstream press, while also being censored as disinformation by social media giants. Internally, national and electoral politics were also influencing the analysis of our intelligence on China within the IC, as reflected in the January 6, 2021 report by the intelligence community's analytic ombudsman. As a career non-political official, the ombudsman found, quote, analysts appeared reluctant to have their analysis on China brought forward because they tend to disagree with the Trump administration's policies, saying, in effect, I don't want our intelligence used to support those policies, end quote. To this day, the CIA, which I believe is unquestionably the world's premier spy agency with an unrivaled capacity to acquire information, has continued to state that it does not have enough information to make any formal assessment. To put it bluntly, I think this is unjustifiable and a reflection not that the agency can't make an assessment with any confidence, but that it won't. Some 3.5 years later, the only plausible assessment the agency could make with any level of confidence is that a virus which killed over 1 million Americans originated in a Chinese lab whose research included work for the Chinese military. And such an assessment would obviously have enormous geopolitical implications that I believe the current administration does not want to face head on. Let me close by saying that I think that the search for the truth should drive where we go from here, and everyone, from our intelligence agencies to members of the administration, to members of Congress, to public health officials, should put politics aside and let our intelligence speak the truth about what happened. Speak the truth to the Americans who deserve that truth, deserve justice, and deserve accountability. And only by seeking truth, justice, and accountability for this pandemic can we achieve the other equally important goal of preventing the next pandemic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director. I now recognize Mr. Feith to give an opening statement.
Chairman Wenstrup, Ranking Member Ruiz, and select subcommittee members, thanks for this opportunity. My written testimony that I've submitted has 3 elements. First, it describes how the State Department's East Asia Bureau approached the COVID origin issue during the first year of the pandemic, from the outbreak to the publication in January 2021 of a fact sheet on activity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Second, it describes the terribly damaging effects of our public health establishment's efforts to stigmatize the very notion that COVID may have emerged from a laboratory accident. This drove underground discussion of a set of risks, namely those involving gain-of-function research, that deserve to be at the front and center of our policymaking. Third, it offers some oversight and policy suggestions on helping to find the origin of COVID, to fix policy and intelligence problems raised by these issues, and to tighten U.S. science and technology exchanges with China to protect national security and to help prevent a next pandemic. In my short remarks here, I want to stress the stakes involved in whether COVID emerged from nature or from a lab. The stakes are almost unimaginably grave. COVID was not some immaculate infection. It was not spontaneously generated. It came from somewhere, and the details matter. If it emerged naturally, it implies certain things about human interactions with nature where the risks are sizable enough. But if it emerged from a lab, particularly one conducting gain-of-function virology experiments with technologies invented only a few years ago, then this was akin to a Hiroshima event, revealing new and modern high-tech risks to human civilizations and even to our species. This is what makes it such a scandal that many of the most influential U.S. government and academic authorities on virology were coordinating to, as one said, disprove any type of lab theory. These officials and scientists knew that COVID may have come from a lab. They knew that a lab leak could have resulted from research in Wuhan funded by the US government. And they knew that if such research were in fact part of COVID's origin, they could face professional and personal embarrassment. So these officials and scientists evidently collaborated to convince the government and the public not to investigate the origin of COVID, at least not in a fashion that followed the evidence down paths that could point to a lab origin. The misdirection tactics worked. The lab leak theory became stigmatized, driven underground. And yet evidence continued to mount in its favor. By late 2020, colleagues at State flagged new US government information that underscored the plausibility of a lab leak. Most significant, there were sick researchers inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology just before the public outbreak in Wuhan. That same Wuhan lab had a long record of secrecy about its coronavirus research and undisclosed ties with China's military. Working with ODNI, we at State arranged to make this information public. Some of our colleagues warned us not to. They said not to highlight China's gain-of-function research, lest we draw attention to the US government's own role in such research and open a Pandora's box. It wasn't clear exactly what these colleagues feared, but their seeming demand for non-transparency was unpersuasive. On January 15, 2021, we published a fact sheet on activity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In the months that followed, the lab leak possibility began to force its way into the mainstream. By May 2021, President Biden himself recognized the significance of the lab leak possibility and ordered a 90-day review of US intelligence. Unfortunately, progress since then has been limited. We now know that the FBI and the Department of Energy both assess that a lab leak is most likely. That's important. But we don't need a running intelligence community straw poll as much as we need a transparent, whole-of-government campaign to recognize the gravely high stakes of the lab leak possibility and pursue appropriate policy reforms. Gain-of-function technologies of the kind that emerged only in the last 10 to 15 years, where the deadliest viruses can conceivably be fused with the most infectious ones, appear to pose a species-level risk to human life. It has been commonly said for 75 years that nuclear weapons could destroy the world or humanity, and so they might. But that would likely require many decisions in at least 2 capitals over some sustained period of time. The gain-of-function risk is that one mistake in one place, let alone one deliberate act by some actor, is all that it takes. Once a virus of sufficient infectiousness and deadliness escapes a lab, there may be nothing humanity can do to stop it. This is the stunning tragedy of those experts who stigmatized even the notion of a lab leak. Faced with a possible dry run of the worst-case pandemic that gain-of-function science has made the world have to fear, the authorities who know the most about this threat didn't speak up. Many even sought to silence others. This has caused a paralytic effect to this day, not only on public awareness, but on the policy reforms that we need to protect ourselves from lab risks in the future. Overcoming this handicap is a major obligation for lawmakers and policymakers going forward. As for trying still to confirm COVID's origin, I'd quickly note 3 points. First, the immediate declassification test. Congress recently passed a law requiring the Biden administration to declassify intelligence on COVID's origin within 90 days. This is a third test for the IC and the rest of the interagency after failures to disclose in 2020 and 2021. There is no doubt that the administration has far more information than has been released publicly. Second, the sick researchers still stand alone. The sick Wuhan lab researchers identified in the January 2021 fact sheet remain the best lead into who or what was patient zero. No animal anywhere has been identified as a comparably likely source of the outbreak. The Biden administration, like the Trump administration before it, has more information about the sick researchers than has been released. Third and finally, what changed the Department of Energy's mind? The most significant fresh piece of intelligence we know about post-2020 is whatever reportedly motivated the Energy Department's recent change of assessment. Maximizing the release of this information would clearly shed additional light on the COVID mystery. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Veith. I now recognize Dr. Lowenthal to give an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman Winstrup, Ranking Member Ruiz, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss intelligence and the origins of the COVID pandemic. I have spent most of my adult life as an intelligence analyst or as a manager of intelligence analysts. I have also taught analytical skills to hundreds of new analysts. To be a good intelligence analyst, you have to have the ability to deal with ambiguity. Very often, analysts are asked to address issues for which there may not be a final definitive answer. Analysts live in a world where there may be several possibilities, each of which has its own degree of certainty and uncertainty. This can be very frustrating to policymakers who want an answer. Given the available intelligence and our own expertise, a specific answer cannot always be determined. This seems to be the case at this point in terms of the origin of the coronavirus in China. There has not been sufficient intelligence to date to make a firm judgment as to whether the virus occurred naturally or was the result of activity in a lab, whether witting or accidental. The ODNI's October 2021 declassified assessment on COVID-19 origins, which you both cited, reflects this uncertainty. 4 intelligence agencies assess that the virus originated naturally with low confidence. 1 intelligence agency believes the virus originated in a lab with moderate confidence. 3 intelligence agencies are unable to make a determination either way. Again, this can be frustrating to policymakers, but that is the nature of intelligence. One of the points that I stress to new analysts is that you want your reader, the policymaker, to understand and appreciate your uncertainty as well as your certainty, because they will be making decisions based on your analysis, and you do not want to portray a confidence and a certainty that misrepresents your intelligence. Absent greater cooperation and transparency from China, which seems highly unlikely, we may never resolve this issue with certainty. It is important that we look back at the intelligence and policy experience from the pandemic and ask ourselves, what can we do better next time? I have a few recommendations. We should consider creating a National Intelligence Officer for Health Issues, who, with his or her office, would serve as the focal point for U.S. intelligence collection and analysis, not only on health issues that threaten the United States, but also looking at health issues worldwide that can be destabilizing regionally. The intelligence community likely needs to hire analysts with backgrounds in medicine, epidemiology, and other areas. There is a section of the Centers for Disease Control that has TSSCI cleared analysts, but I think the larger intelligence community needs more in-house expertise in these issues. Finally, it is important to avoid politicizing intelligence efforts on issues like the COVID pandemic. The intelligence community prides itself on being nonpartisan and objective, and I believe we meet these standards on a high, consistent basis. Intelligence may sometimes be discomforting, but that does not mean that it may run counter to preferred policy preferences, but that does not mean that it is partisan or subjective. it becomes increasingly difficult for intelligence officers to do their best work when they are put under constant partisan pressure or when they are consistently accused of being partisan. Some people refer to the role of the intelligence community as telling truth to power. I find that phrase objectionable, as it is arrogant, and, more to the point, we do not have truth in many cases, but well-sourced, well-thought-out analytic conclusions. These will sometimes run counter to the preferred views or outcomes of policymakers. That does not mean the intelligence has been politicized. It means that intelligence is being honest when talking to power. That is a great responsibility, and the intelligence community takes it very seriously. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all very much. I now recognize myself for a series of questions. If you have had the chance to follow the initial workings of this subcommittee to date, you would know that the drive of this committee is to perform an after-action review, have lessons learned, create a path forward for any future pandemic so that we may be able to predict, prepare for, protect ourselves, and hopefully prevent any future pandemic. This, I believe, would be consistent with the suggestion made by Dr. Lowenthal. Hopefully, we may produce a product that will allow us to certainly be better next time out of this committee. It's a fair question why decisions may have been made. Were they based on data, hypothesis? Were there motives to the decisions, such as personal gain or political gain? All fair questions. Dr. Lowenthal recommended having a National Intelligence Officer for Health. In many ways, I believe we have this with the National Center for Medical Intelligence, but we may need to expand their role. It was also suggested that the intelligence community hire experts with backgrounds in medicine and epidemiology and other specialties. And I agree with that, and that's why I've been requesting from OD&I information concerning those experts that they have consulted during the review of the origins question. I'm interested in knowing which actual specialists weighed in for each component of the IC. If one agency has 20 virologists and another has none, that can make a huge difference in an analyst's outcomes. So I'm curious as to why so many agencies have different opinions on this. The expertise of those that have contributed to each agency matters and makes a difference. For this committee, I have stated that honesty is non-negotiable. That requires truth. And I understand that 100% certainty in an analysis is difficult to come by. But what can be truthful is the level of confidence in an analytic summary. Unfortunately, during my time on the Intelligence Committee, I've seen cases of what seems to be political partisanship. I've seen a situation where analysts came forward as whistleblowers, charging that their analyses were changed or ignored for political purposes. In other words, their analysis stated that things were going badly, and yet after going up the chain, a politician stated that everything was going well. Mr. Ratcliffe, as OD&I, did you ever feel that information was being withheld from you or altered in any way, or did you have that concern?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that fortunately that did not happen very often, but it did happen on occasion, and I didn't just feel it. As I referenced in my opening remarks, the analytic ombudsman referenced the fact that there were times when intelligence was suppressed.
So why and what kind of information was that, if you can share it?
Well, as it's already been publicly available, the ombudsman made specific reference to intelligence on China.
So did this, in your opinion, hamstring your ability to conduct your job?
I think it made it more difficult, but through persistence and some of the things that Mr. Feith talked about, we were able to, in looking at the intelligence, particularly as it related to COVID origins, to still get to a point where we could protect sources and methods, and yet make some of that intelligence available by declassifying it. And he referenced the process whereby we did that through a State Department fact sheet.
One of the aspects of this investigation that is most important is learning who the IC consulted with during the review. As I said, we want to know what kinds of experts each component worked with. I'm going to ask each of you, to each witness, do you think this question is an important one when it comes to origins of COVID?
I'll begin just by saying it is, because sometimes, in this case particularly, when we're talking about COVID-19, our analytic judgments are framed in part by science. And so who the scientists are and how they're motivated certainly is important.
Yes, sir, I'd agree, and just add the element that conflicts of interest in general and with respect to the enormous amount of scientific exchange with China are especially important, as China is central to our national security analytical work going forward.
Doctor?
I think it's fair to ask the Intelligence Committee who they consulted with, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Feith, you were heavily involved in this investigation from the side of the State Department. While you were gathering information, did you struggle to find experts that did not have conflicts of interest?
In short, yes, and that problem became clearer in retrospect also.
And do you believe these same conflicted scientists may be briefing the IC today?
I can't speculate about today, but based on the experience a few years ago, yes.
Thank you. Quickly to Director Ratcliffe and Dr. Lowenthal, in your opinion, is it acceptable or practical to avoid or ignore the truth from Congress if trying not to divulge or to shield a covert operation?
I don't think it's ever appropriate to ignore the truth. I think from the intelligence community standpoint, there's an ability to protect sources and methods, but still meet our obligations to keep members of Congress informed through its proper oversight role.
Doctor?
There is a provision of law that requires that Congress be fully and currently informed of all current and significant anticipated activities. I'm probably the only person in this room who was in the Senate chamber when the Senate Intelligence Committee was created, so I am an advocate for congressional oversight, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I have read that statute myself, but I've had to bring it up and still get fought a few times in the Intelligence Committee. So the next question for the two of you, is it important for the IC to try to know all they can about the weapons systems of our adversaries, including biological weapons?
Absolutely, and in the case of China, the intelligence community has publicly addressed China as our top national security threat from a nation-state perspective. So particularly, that's important with respect to the country of China.
Mr. Chairman, yes, this has always been a high priority for U.S. intelligence since the committee was created in 1947.
Thank you. Should a virus that killed more than 1 million Americans be an intelligence priority for the IC, and specifically the CIA and DIA?
Absolutely.
Doctor?
That depends on the policymakers. We don't make our priorities. The President, the National Security Council determine the priorities for the intelligence community. So if they determine it's a priority, then yes, it is. If they decide there are higher priorities, then no, it isn't. But this is not a call for the intelligence community. This is something that's not understood. We don't set our priorities. We are there to respond to the policymakers. I helped create the current priority system, and it's one where we derive from the President and his National Security Council where are the areas you want the most emphasis, knowing that inevitably there are going to be areas where we spend less attention because we have finite resources.
Well, that's a fair assessment. I would have to say as a policymaker that I think it should be a very high intelligence priority. Well taken. Finally, Director Ratcliffe, we sent a request letter to Director Haynes on February 13. To date, we have yet to receive any documents from ODNI. Understanding all the appropriate restrictions on classified material, as a former director, do you believe it's important for ODNI to fully cooperate with our investigation and produce the requested documents?
Yes.
I would now like to yield to Ranking Member Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, understanding how COVID-19 came to be is critical to America's public health. I want to point out and make clear that we wouldn't even be having this hearing in the first place if it wasn't for President Biden taking early and decisive action in May 2021 to investigate whether the novel coronavirus originated in a lab or nature. President Biden directed the intelligence community to conduct this review to, quote, do everything we can to trace the roots of this outbreak that has caused so much pain and death around the world so that we can take every necessary precaution to prevent it from happening again. In fact, the very intelligence that Democrats and Republicans voted to declassify last month was collected because of President Biden's directive for the intelligence community to use every tool at its disposal to investigate COVID-19's origins. Dr. Lowenthal, can I get a quick yes or no? Was President Biden's directive a critical step in advancing our understanding of the pandemic's origins?
Yes.
I agree. And thanks to this action, we're making progress every day in advancing our understanding of the pandemic's origins, despite continued obstruction from the Chinese Communist Party. And while we know more now than we ever did before, the fact of the matter is that the intelligence community's assessment remains inconclusive on whether the virus emerged from either human contact with an animal or from a laboratory accident. Various elements of the intelligence community have made different assessments, all but one of which were made with low confidence, meaning without certainty. Dr. Lowenthal, you have explained that the function of intelligence is to reduce uncertainty. When intelligence on a particular issue is divided between two conclusions, what is the best course of action for policymakers? Should we prepare in the event of both scenarios?
Probably, but policymakers can make their own decisions regardless of the intelligence you give them. We are not speaking ex cathedra. We are giving their best intelligence, and then they are making decisions. But if you had two strong possibilities, and I were a policymaker, which I've only done once or twice in my career, I would say, yes, you should try to protect against both of them.
I agree with this, too, and this is exactly the approach that President Biden and Democrats have taken, an approach that puts people over politics. While our intelligence community continues to collect and analyze information that will bring us closer to a definitive conclusion, we have worked to prevent and better prepare for the next deadly pandemic so that we can keep the American people safe, no matter if this threat originates from an animal or a lab. In fact, last Congress, Democrats included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 significant reforms to address pandemic preparedness. This includes provisions to enhance safety standards for biomedical research involving pathogens of pandemic potential and to recruit more public health workers with epidemiological backgrounds. It also includes reforms to prevent undue foreign influence in our nation's biomedical research, such as the requirement that participation in foreign talent programs be disclosed to receive NIH grants, and a provision directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services and national security officials to identify and develop strategies that address threats to sensitive biomedical research. There's a whole host of other common sense reforms that we passed last Congress as part of this package that are outlined on this fact sheet. Mr. Chairman, permission to enter it into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And you know, I find it interesting that despite how much my colleagues on the other side of this dais have focused their efforts to push a lab leak narrative, they voted against these reforms that help prevent lab leaks in the future. I also want to point out the good work the administration is doing by partnering with our allies to press for strong international standards for biosafety and security as part of its national security strategy. And while these are all good steps forward, I do think that there's more we should do and can do. Dr. Lowenthal, what additional steps should we be taking from an intelligence and policy perspective to build on this work and to better prepare us for future pandemics?
Well, I outlined those in my opening statement, Mr. Ruiz, but one of the things you have to remember about the Intelligence Committee is we are a volunteer organization. I cannot draft doctors any more than the military can draft individuals. And so when we go out looking for people, looking for experts, we have to hope they want to come work for us. But we obviously have gaps. The National Military Intelligence Center is there, but they are mostly have been devoted to supporting the defense establishment, which is fine. I'm suggesting we need broader expertise than that. But you have to remember, we can only recruit the people who come to the recruiting table. This is one of the great frustrations of my life in my last 3 years at CIA. But we have to look at our expertise across the community, and we have a system for doing that, and ask ourselves, where are the gaps, and then how do I go hire the people to fill in those gaps?
Dr. Lowenthal, I received my medical doctorate at Harvard Medical School. I received my master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School. And I realized that when I was at the Kennedy School, the CIA was there recruiting students to join their firm. Yet there was no recruitment happening in the public health school, which I later received a master's in public health from Harvard School of Public Health, or from the Harvard Medical School. So perhaps one of the suggestions would be to entertain the career options for public health and physicians and scientists to join the intelligence communities in doing their research as well.
I think that would be a good idea. There were also no CIA recruiters when I got my degree from the Harvard History Department. We tend to, we have to rethink how we recruit. So going to medical schools, public health policy schools would be a very good idea.
Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Comer from Kentucky, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today. As I've said from the beginning, discovering the origins of COVID-19 is vital to both the public health and national security of the United States. Former CDC Director Redfield testified last month that this is not simply a scientific question, but also one of intelligence. And I agree with that. And we need to ensure the intelligence is accurate and truthful. On March 17, 2020, one of the most influential papers of all time was published in the scientific journal Nature Medicine, entitled The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. It was prompted by Dr. Fauci and written to suppress the lab leak hypothesis. This paper stated that no type of lab-based scenario is possible. Director Ratliff, is that factual?
It is not.
Mr. Feith, to you, is that statement factual?
Based on my understanding, no.
10 days later, on March 26th, the State Department produced a memo that stated U.S. scientists assessed the virus emerged naturally. It continued to say a lab leak was improbable and not supported by the available evidence. Director Ratliff, are those statements factual?
They are not.
Mr. Feith, to you, are those statements factual?
No, they were at best overstated.
Mr. Feith, you were involved in the briefing that produced that memo?
I was a recipient of the briefing that the memo is an account of.
So while serving at the State Department investigating the origins of COVID-19, were you ever briefed by an author of the proximal origin paper?
Yes, sir.
During the preparation of that memo, which I referenced above, do you believe the unnamed scientist had apparent conflicts of interest?
In short, yes, especially based on what we know since then about them.
Were the authors, were they the ones that were briefing the intelligence community, the authors